Dangerous Games by Danielle Steele. Chapter 1, Part 2.
Alex came by her talent and courage honestly. Her father had been a famous British journalist and had been killed by a bomb in Ireland while covering a story when she was a child. She remembered him only dimly, but from everything she knew about him, he had been a wonderful man. Her mother, Isabel, was French. Alex had grown up in London, gone to college in the States, and once she decided to stay there to work in TV news for a major network, her mother had moved back to the small town she came from in Provence. She had been a good mother and never interfered with what Alex chose to do. Alex loved her fiercely and visited her whenever she could, which was never often enough. Alex's college years in the States had been turbulent and stormy. A romance in her sophomore year had led to the birth of a daughter a year later. The baby's father had been a year younger, a sweet boy who was passionately in love with Alex, and tried to match her courage when she decided to have the baby, much to his parents' dismay. They were cool Bostonians from a wealthy banking family, and their dreams for their son did not include an illegitimate child, nor marriage to an unknown girl from London, from what they considered an insignificant family, no matter how bright Alex was. And her dreams of following in her father's footsteps as a journalist did not please them either, although Wyatt thought she was amazing. Despite his parents' protests, they were married less than a month before Faye was born. The delivery was easy, but everything that came after wasn't. Wyatt's parents cut off all financial support, and Isabel came from London to help them with the baby, although she wasn't thrilled with Alex's decision either. But young love had prevailed over reason, and 3 months later, the unthinkable happened. While vacationing with friends in Nantucket, Wyatt was killed in a boating accident, and Alex became a 20-year-old widow with a 3-month-old infant. Still in shock over Wyatt's death, Alex and her mother attended the funeral in Boston, where they realized that Wyatt's family had told no one about their son's marriage or his child, and Alex and her mother were treated like unwelcome strangers. A somber conversation with Wyatt's father the day after the funeral made clear that his family wanted no contact with Alex or their granddaughter in the future. They considered her nothing more than a youthful mistake he had made, and they felt no bond to mother or child. They wouldn't even look at their son's infant daughter. Alex went back to London with her mother then, and after a month of long, tearful discussions, Isabel convinced her to go back to school and leave Faye with her in London. Alex was torn, even as she boarded the plane to go back to school in the States to finish her junior year, and once there it became obvious that it had been the right decision, and her mother had been wise. A year later, with near-perfect grades, Alex graduated with honours and got an extraordinary opportunity in network news in New York. She was on her way. She went home to visit her mother and daughter whenever she could, but she was deeply immersed in her demanding job for several years. Isabel moved back to France then, to Provence, and took Faye with her, while Alex accepted every challenging assignment they gave her. She could never have achieved the early years of her career with a baby to care for, and Faye thrived with her grandmother. She was 5 when Alex finally decided to bring her to New York, which was challenging, but she wanted her daughter with her and felt ready to cope. They managed. Faye spent summers with her grandmother in France, and a nanny cared for her in New York while Alex travelled for her job. It wasn't ideal, but it worked. And Alex and her daughter had in common that they had grown up without their fathers. It created a special bond between them, and Faye worried fiercely about her mother when she saw her on TV when she was away or on assignment. Isabel had never complained about Alex's chosen career, but Faye did all the time, and accused her mother of being irresponsible and trying to get killed. "I don't have a father. What will I do if something happens to you?" she said angrily. "You'd go to live with Mamie. she said, referring to her mother in Provence. Faye's paternal grandparents had never made contact again in 19 years. Alex had always thought they would eventually, but they never did. Faye didn't exist for them. She remained an embarrassment they chose to deny, with no sentiment for their late son's only child. "That's not good enough," Faye would say to her mother in a fury about the dangers of her job. "I need you too, not just Mamie." The truth was that Alex and Faye needed each other, but Alex loved her career too, and was determined to stay in it. And when Faye left for college, Alex felt free to take tougher, longer, more dangerous assignments than ever. Every fibre of her being came alive on those assignments. Faye was proud of her, but upset about it too. It was a constant battle between the two women. Faye was 19 years old and a sophomore at Duke, and she knew that if there was a war, an uprising, or a terrorist attack somewhere, her mother would wind up there, drawn like a moth to flame. And the network she worked for took full advantage of her willingness to leave at the drop of a hat and go anywhere they sent her. Anyone who knew Alex was acutely aware of the fact that nothing could stop her. If there was trouble somewhere in the world, Alex had to be in it, just as she was now, and because of the way she'd grown up, Faye was fiercely independent too. She was as determined as her mother. She wanted to go to law school after college, and Alex was sure she would, and she could afford to send her now. Her job as star reporter for a major network paid her well, but her work wasn't about money for Alex. Her career was her passion. She loved what she did. She found each assignment new and exciting, and she was the consummate professional. Like her father, Alex was a journalist to the core, and she liked being a war correspondent best of all. She and Ben had that in common, which was why they worked well together, on the toughest assignments the network could give them. Alex never talked about her personal life or her past. Ben had been startled to learn a year after they started working together that she had a child. Her willingness to risk her life in the line of duty had never suggested to him that she had a family at home, and in fact she didn't. All she had was Faye and her mother in France. In that sense, she and Ben were very much alike. In his case, he was divorced with no children, and she knew he had parents and 3 brothers, somewhere in the Midwest, whom he rarely saw. He had nephews and nieces, although he saw little of them, and said that he and his family had nothing in common. They thought him an oddball for leaving home and joining the SEALs. He said that the military had been his family for many years. He had strong moral values and a need to protect those around him, but he had no close personal ties Alex was aware of. And when she had questioned him about why he left the SEALs, all he said was, "It was time," and clearly didn't want to talk about it. Like Alex, he was an intensely private person. They were there to do a job together, and that was what they did, like 2 soldiers of fortune bringing the truth to their viewers and shedding light on treason, betrayals, and crimes against humanity around the world. Above all, Alex believed in exposing evil deeds and shocking events, and so did Ben, whatever the risk to them to do so. "Did you have time to call Faye?" Ben asked casually as they flew back to New York. He liked hearing about her, and he thought Faye a bright, interesting young woman, like her mother, willing to stand up for her ideals. Ben had left home more than 20 years before, and had been divorced for 14 years. He never talked about his ex-wife, and Alex correctly sensed he didn't want to, so she didn't ask. They were each entitled to their memories and secrets. They were colleagues, not lovers, and had become friends working hard together.
She had an entire wardrobe of combat clothes she wore for work, unlike any of the other women Ben knew. "No, I think I'll go into the office and see what's on my desk," she said vaguely. He always told her she was a workaholic, and she could no longer deny it. The evidence to support his theory was overwhelming, and she looked lively and full of energy as they stepped off the plane and headed toward baggage claim. She was tireless, which drove him crazy at times, when he was tired himself. She never was, or at least it never showed. They knew the airport well, and had spent far too many hours there, waiting for delayed planes to take off. Ben had expected her to say she was going to work. He knew that she'd sit at her desk for several hours, eventually take a shower at the office and put on more of the same clothes, and in the end, not bother to go home and stay till all hours. She hated going home to her empty apartment. He couldn't wait to get back to his own apartment in Brooklyn and sleep on clean sheets in his comfortable bed that night. The thought of it was sheer heaven to him, after 4 days of bad motels and catnaps in the back of a car. Alex didn't care where she slept, or if she did, and didn't need much sleep, which was an advantage she had over him and most people. Women glanced at Ben as they walked through the airport. He was a powerfully built, tall, handsome man. But in spite of that, Alex had always been indifferent to his charm. She loved working with him, but had never been interested in him as a man, and they knew each other too well. They had seen each other in lots of unpleasant, terrifying, awkward, and embarrassing situations, and Alex knew instinctively that it would have spoiled everything if they'd ever gotten involved. And he had expressed no interest in romance with her either. They both liked their relationship just the way it was, uncomplicated and entirely based on work. They were well matched to work together in every way. Many teams the producers put together were a lot less compatible than the two of them, and some fought all the time and hated each other off screen. Some of the battles behind the scenes at the network were legendary, but not between the two of them. They'd become fast friends right from the beginning and still were. They each picked up their suitcase off the moving belt. Alex managed her own with ease. Ben no longer offered to help her. He knew she wouldn't have let him anyway. Alex prized her independence above all, and took pride in taking care of herself. They took separate cabs into the city, and she headed for work, curious about what she'd find. And when she got there, she discovered, as she always did, a mountain that had sprung up on her desk while she was gone. Notices, memos, copy they wanted from her to go with her stories, fact-checking, edicts from management that had been circulated around the office while they were away. By late that night, she had gotten through most of it. She was too tired to go home by then, and stretched out on the couch in her office and fell asleep. She woke up before the others came in the next morning, took a shower, put on jeans and a sweater from her suitcase, poured herself a stiff cup of coffee, and was back at her desk when Felix Winters, her senior producer, walked in. "Did you sleep here?" Felix asked her wryly, knowing the answer before she nodded with a grin. Of course. It didn't surprise him. He was pleased with their coverage of the riots. She could see it on his face. He rarely said it, but he liked almost everything she did. He wasn't lavish with praise, but had deep respect for her. "Bring your coffee to my office and let's catch up," he said, and she nodded and promised to be there in a minute, as an assistant producer stuck his head into her office. They had a breaking story to put on the morning news ahead of everything else, and he wanted to let her know. An earthquake in Afghanistan had killed thousands of people. She wondered if she and Ben would get sent out on the story, and headed to Felix's office. Alex and Felix both kept a close eye on the monitor on his desk while they chatted. The videos and live coverage from Afghanistan were awful, with bodies piling up in the streets and people crying, and buildings turned to rubble, with people trapped inside them. "It looked nasty in Alabama. I was worried about you," he said with obvious concern. "We were fine, but it was ugly. They sent the troops in too late. It was out of control by then." The senior producer was distracted as she said it, and he nodded, looking pensive. "What's up?" She knew that expression on his face. He hesitated for a minute before answering with a sheepish grin. "One of my crazy hunches. Don't ask me why, but I saw a photograph of the vice president yesterday. It's bothering me." "You've never liked him," Alex reminded him with a smile. "True. He just seems phony to me.
And for a guy who plays holier than thou and claims to be Mr. Clean, I don't like the company he keeps. And where did he get all that money so fast? He married it, she said with an ironic expression. That's one way to make easy money. Sometimes not so easy, Felix quipped, and she laughed. I don't know. Something about him always seems wrong to me. She had heard it before. Who was he with in the photo you saw? She asked with interest. Felix had good instincts, but he had his share of pet peeves too, and the vice president had always been one of them, although he'd had a dignified career, and the right connections, the late Senator Bill Foster being his closest friend. Foster was considered a political icon, and they were planning a presidential campaign together when Foster died. But Felix didn't like Tony Clark anyway. He was with a state gaming commissioner. And every time I play golf in D.C., I see him with some lobbyist or other, and none of the ones people respect.
That's not against the law, Alex teased him. I know, wishful thinking. I always hope we'll catch him doing something illegal one of these days, but he's too smart for that. So are too honest, Alex said cautiously. She had no strong feelings about the vice president one way or the other. Tony Clark was smart, rich and successful, and impressively connected socially and politically. So he played the game well, too much so to risk it by doing anything foolish in her opinion, but Felix never agreed. He thought him overconfident and arrogant. Do me a favor, sniff around your Washington contacts and see if anything turns up. You never know. Hope springs eternal. She laughed at him as she left his office and then turned to ask him, Are you sending us to Afghanistan? I'll let you know, he said, watching the monitor intently as she left, and she thought about his dogged search for malfeasance by the vice president. She never agreed with him on that, but she'd check her sources anyway to humor him. He was her boss after all, and sometimes he was right. Not this time though, she was sure. Felix just had an issue with him. It was visceral, he couldn't stand the guy. She was watching the morning news from a monitor on her desk when Ben walked in an hour later. He looked fresh and rested, but so did she. After a few hours sleep on her office couch, work always invigorated her and Ben guessed correctly unless she hadn't bothered to go home. So are we heading for Afghanistan? He asked her as he lowered himself into a chair across from her and glanced at the monitor on her disc. Felix hasn't told me yet. He's on a witch hunt for the vice president again. She smiled at Ben. He wants me to check it out. Indeed. Clark's a busy guy, Ben said of the vice president, looking unimpressed. And I've never liked him either. Something about him always rubs me the wrong way, but I think he's clean. He's too smart and ambitious not to be. He agreed with Alex about that. Vice President Tony Clark was in his early 40s, had previously been divorced from a wealthy socialite, had married a much younger woman in his second marriage for age 4 years before, and had 2 very young children. They were the picture-perfect vice presidential family. They even had a golden retriever named Lucky. His young wife was the heiress to one of the biggest fortunes in the country, and her father had been the largest donor to the last presidential campaign. Tony Clark always seemed to have it easy, and even when things went wrong for him, he always landed on his feet shortly after. Clark had been on the fast-track to run for the vice presidency with Senator Bill Foster, a childhood friend. It had been an obvious pairing due to her length of painthy connection. Foster had all the charm, wit, political expertise, charisma, connections, and intelligence to run a fantastic campaign to win a presidential election in a few years and take Clark with him. So until Foster was murdered during his second senatorial campaign, Bill Foster's father was one of the most famous kingmakers in Washington, and they were an important political family. So Widow's brother was a senator from Connecticut. Foster knew the right people, but Clark had the money, and not his own, but he had access to big campaign donors. Together, they'd been an unbeatable team. Instead, after Foster's death, Clark took a year to reinvent himself and emerged as one of the hottest tickets of the hour with another senator who had the inside track to the White House. Tony Clark married his current wife 2 years after Foster was assassinated. Clark was an important presence in the lives of Foster's widow and 2 children. He and Olympia Foster were occasionally seen together in public, and he had been a strong emotional support system for the last 6 years. Since her husband's death, she had been reclusive and had almost disappeared. She had been the perfect mate for Foster, and his staunch supporters were as much in love with her as they had been with him. As she thought about it, Alex wondered what had happened to Olympia. It had been months since her name had even been mentioned, although it was known that she and the vice president had remained close friends. Faye had once sent her a fan letter and gotten a warm response. Olympia Foster was a lovely person, and like others, Alex had always thought there was something Kennedy-esque about her. She had the same kind of dignified elegance and shy grace as Jackie. And like Jackie, she had survived her husband's tragic death, shot by a random assassin, Wasanda Aishu was with him, which made the public sympathize with Olympia even more. How do you two feel about Curry? Felix stuck his head back in the door and asked them both. Alex looked disinterested, but Ben said he liked it. "Are you ordering lunch?" Ben asked him. "No, there's a scandal in the high-tech world in India. I'm sending you both to New Delhi tonight. You're on a 9 p.m. flight," he said matter-of-factly. "International check-in at 7, he reminded them. "I'd better get home and repack my bags," Alex commented, forgetting their conversation about the vice president. There were no clean clothes left in the bag she'd brought back from Alabama, and she wouldn't need combat gear in New Delhi. She needed summer dresses and sandals. "He doesn't waste a minute, does he?" Ben said after Felix left, looking hesitant about flying to India that night. "It sounds like a good story," Alex commented, trying to be positive about it. She loved her work, sometimes more than he did, and he was tired after Alabama. She wasn't. "They're all good stories when you're doing them," Ben Chapman said honestly. "I'd better get going," Alex said as she stood up. She had 1,000 things to do to prepare for another trip on such short notice, and they both knew that they would have to attend a long briefing about the Indian story that afternoon if they were leaving that night. She hailed a cab outside the network building a few minutes later. She thought about the assignment in India as they sped downtown and made some notes to herself of things she wanted to research for the story. She thought of her daughter and was going to call her before they left. Alex got out of the cab in front of her battered building in the East Village and went inside to Miave. Despite Ben's momentary fatigue and apparent lack of enthusiasm, she was excited to be going to India that night. What she did so well was in her blood and still made her heart race after all these years. And anyone who knew her knew that was never going to change.